Hello, thanks for coming this morning. I'm very happy to be able to introduce Brady Bowman. He's an associate professor at Penn State University, and at the moment he's an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Today he'll be talking about skepticism and intellectual freedom, a post-Kantian perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. For some of us, it was sort of a late night. Thanks especially, of course, to Anthony and to Abby for the kind invitation to come here and speak. And thanks to the people who've been presenting papers the last few days. It's been a really wonderful and stimulating conference up to now. I hope that it continues to my talk. This is a paper about Hegel and Shelling, and I went back and forth a little bit in terms of links, whether to do just one thing on Hegel or just focus on Shelling. But it was really important to me to have sort of both thinkers in this paper because of the shape of the thought that I sort of want to communicate. And so even at the risk of not being able to go into very much detail or even leaving, really big gaps here and there, it was more important to me to have both. So what you're getting is not even so much a sketch as a kind of philosophical gesture or drawing. But I hope that it'll be clear enough in its contours to sort of indicate where the center of gravity is and what the direction of motion is. Another thing is that it's going to be kind of, there's a few longish quotations, and I also considered sort of taking those out and just giving you sort of the straight dope, as it were, without all of the exegetical aspect of it. But some of these quotations are so rich and expressive and bring the various aspects of this complex topic together in such a compact way that I thought it was better to share those. So there will be one or two longish quotations, but they're kind of, for me, something of a kind of highlight of the topic. The handout that you've got contains those quotations. These are all my translations. So that's that. With no further ado, then, let me just jump into it. Skepticism and intellectual freedom. In modern and mainstream epistemology, skepticism has by and large been treated as a philosophical challenge to be either met and overcome or diffused and set aside. The attitude of epistemology has to this extent been dogmatic or dogmatist. From early on, skeptics were confronted with the objection that action requires beliefs to guide it, and that the skeptical ideal of a life without beliefs is therefore nonsensical. Perhaps this objection underlies most epistemologists' dogmatic attitude toward the problem of skepticism. Even Hume was careful to emphasize that his skepticism was limited to the theoretical and abstruse realm of metaphysics, and was meant to have no effect on our natural ability to form beliefs and act. And self-avowed Puranists like Sextus obviously also felt the pressure of the objection, since they felt compelled to offer appearances, involuntary feelings, customs, and laws as practical criteria for action, all the while insisting that submission to the guidance of such appearances was somehow different from assertion or belief. But quite aside from the pragmatic advantages of true belief, and especially of true justified belief, many have thought that knowledge has an intrinsic value of its own. This ingrained commitment to the value of knowledge is without doubt also a factor that has led philosophers to want to defend it against skeptical attacks. My purpose in the following is not to take issue with this attitude, this positive attitude towards the value of knowledge. However, I do want to point out that our common perception of skepticism as a challenge or as a problem is based on a prior commitment to the value of knowledge, and that the value of knowledge raises questions of its own, whose answers are no more straightforward than the answers to standard epistemological questions about the definition of knowledge and the nature of justification. On the other side, though, we should also remind ourselves that in many ordinary contexts, skepticism is considered a virtue. Of course, what is understood by skepticism in such contexts is ordinarily not Pyrrhonism, but some more mitigated form of scrutiny. Most of us are instinctively repelled by the idea of being duped, quite apart from any adverse pragmatic consequences that might follow from it, and we resist being fooled regardless of whether the delusion is one perpetrated against us by someone else, a god, for example, or whether it is the result of our own failing. We desire not to be gullible, not to give in to fond belief too quickly or easily, and we praise careful inquirers who exhaust available means of possible falsification before putting forth a theory. Here again, it seems to me that something is at work beyond the desire to increase the probability of our opinions being true. There's something about making up your own mind, or, in Kant's words, about having the courage to use your own understanding, that is intimately connected with human dignity and freedom, and which is also the basis for political demands for intellectual freedom. With this in mind, it is striking that both Hegel and Shelling praise skepticism, especially for its role in realizing and preserving human freedom. Here are the two central statements from the passages I will be focusing on in the body of this paper. The first is from Schelling's Philosophical Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism from 1795. It's quotation number 1 on your handout. He writes, "Nothing is more ruinous for philosophy than the attempt to force it into the boundaries of a universally valid theoretical system. Whoever undertakes to do so is devoid of the authentically critical spirit, which seeks to strike down the vain obsession with demonstrations and proofs in order to save the freedom of science. The skeptic has therefore rendered an infinitely greater service to philosophy by declaring war against every universally binding system in advance. As long as the skeptic dares not to intrude into the sphere of human freedom, who could fail to revere him as a true philosopher?" And here's the passage from Hegel's Skepticism essay, written a few years later, 1802. "The positive side of skepticism," he writes, "was comprised solely by the skeptic's character. Rather than expressing the individuality of his character in a philosophy, Pyrrho's individual character was his philosophy, and his philosophy was nothing but freedom of character. And how could any philosophy be opposed in this respect to skepticism?" These two passages share several conspicuous features. For one, both assert that skepticism is not in and of itself opposed to philosophy, which both nevertheless understand as developing and recommending positive doctrines about reality. Secondly, both link skepticism to a concern with freedom, especially individual freedom, although this is not as salient in the quotation from Schelling as it will become once we consider the remark in context. And thirdly, both associate the freedom that is realized and preserved through the skeptical stance with the practice of undermining attempts to assert propositions as true, adequately justified, and hence binding, though this aspect in turn is not as salient in the Hegel quotation as it will soon become. It's this link between skepticism, freedom, and post-Kantian idealism that I'll be exploring in this talk. Now, before I get into the details of Hegel's and Schelling's respective views on skepticism, I would like to present as a point of contrast a more traditional view of the link between belief and intellectual self-determination. Hegel's Skepticism essay, as some of you will know, is cast as the review of G.E. Schulz's Critique of Theoretical Philosophy, published in 2 volumes in 1801 and 1802. I find the following passage from that work to be an eloquent formulation of a classical view of the link between certainty and intellectual freedom. So here's a lengthier quotation, number 3, on the handout. "Conviction or Überzeugung," writes Schulze, is a state of consciousness that accompanies certain cognitions and that everyone is familiar with, since everyone experiences it and must experience it, for without it we could neither live nor act. Nonetheless, a formal definition cannot convey the specific character of this state. Rather, one comes to know it through immediate apprehension of its content. We have, he says further, no voluntary control over this state. We cannot arbitrarily bring it about in ourselves, nor can we cause it to go away once it is present. It is beyond our control. It's a compulsion undergone by consciousness. Also Zwang. This is the reason we tend to describe it as a feeling, a word that is often used to refer to any state of consciousness that is not subject to the mind's power to direct and dispose. Yet despite the fact that so long as it is in a state of conviction, the thinking self feels bound and inalterably determined, in the eyes of reason, this is not a dishonorable lack of freedom or self-determination, but rather the goal that reason constantly strives for, and in attaining which it gains the satisfaction it was seeking and the highest dignity of which it is capable as a cognitive faculty. The opposite of conviction is a state of doubt, in which the mind is lacking what would determine it to recognize a judgment and take it to be true. End of quotation. Here Schulze self-consciously combines two superficially conflicting descriptions of conviction. It is at once both an involuntary state of compulsion and inalterable determination, and an expression of intellectual freedom and self-determination in which reason is said to achieve its highest dignity. Though he does not say much about the stability of conviction over time, I think it's natural to understand the passage as implying that it is desirable that states of conviction be such that they are durable, stable, robust in the face of conflicting opinions, superficially contrary appearances, and one's own continued use of reason and engagement in inquiry. Someone who finds himself seized with the full force of convictions by a series of incompatible beliefs would surely not appear to us to be especially self-determined or rationally dignified. And people who change their opinions the way they change their shirt are not people who command a high degree of intellectual respect. I'm going to bypass the respects in which Schulze's account seems to be modeled after elements from both Hume and Sextus Empiricus in order to home in on his characterization of conviction as a state of inner psychological compulsion that nonetheless does not represent a diminishment of intellectual self-determination and rational dignity, but rather constitutes, on the contrary, its paradigmatic case. We find a precedent for this way of talking in Descartes' Fourth Meditation, where he discusses freedom and insight in similar terms. Moving on then to quotation 4 on the handout, Descartes says, "The will consists solely in the fact that when something is proposed to us by our intellect, either to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun, we are moved in such a way that we sense that we are determined to it by no external force. In order to be free, I need not be capable of being moved in each direction. On the contrary, the more I am inclined toward one direction, either because I clearly and distinctly perceive that there is in it an aspect of the good and the true, or because God has thus disposed the inner recesses of my thought, the more freely do I choose that direction. However, the indifference that I experience when there is no reason moving me more in one direction than in another is the lowest grade of freedom. It is indicative not of any perfection in freedom, but rather of a defect, that is, a certain negation in knowledge. Were I always to see clearly what is good and true, I would never deliberate about what is to be judged or chosen. In that event, although I would be entirely free, I could never be indifferent." End of quote. Cartesian method generally, and his deployment of methodical doubt in the meditation specifically, is rooted in this conception of psychological indubitability and the corresponding rejection of equipollence as a psychologically defective state and as representative of the lowest grade of freedom. This Cartesian conception of human cognition and freedom is diametrically opposed to Pyrrhonism in obvious ways, so it provides a useful point of contrast for what is to come. However, it is not opposed in every respect. The Pyrrhonist also seeks to overcome the psychological state in which one wavers between two propositions, uncertain which of them is true or false. Although these are not quite the terms in which classical Pyrrhonistes speak, I also think it's fair to say that they would reject arbitrarily decisionistic procedures for settling on a belief, as well as the probabilistic approach recommended by the academics. Like the Cartesian, the Pyrrhonist is also committed to overcoming the vicissitudes of uncertainty and dubitability and achieving a state of unperturbed stability and determination. What is odd about the Pyrrhonist, and especially about Pyrrho himself, as far as his doctrines have been preserved and handed down to us, is that he found this state of unperturbed stability to arise from the insight that no proposition is either true or false, since the things of the world, far from being inherently intelligible, are in themselves, I quote, indifferentiable and immeasurable and undecidable. This is Timon. On this ontological note, then, I now turn to Hegel's interpretation of Pyrrhonian skepticism. I'll begin by picking up the previously cited passage from Hegel's Skepticism essay at a slightly earlier point than what I quoted before, number 5 on the handout. Skepticism may thus be regarded as the first stage, die erste Stufe, of philosophy, for the beginning of philosophy consists precisely in elevating oneself above the truth given by common consciousness and the inkling, die Ahnung, of a higher truth. End of quote. This identification of skepticism with the first stage of philosophy is anything but a throwaway line. And I would like to bring out its significance by adducing for comparison 2 passages from later Hegelian works. The first is drawn from his lectures on the history of philosophy, where he writes, quotation 6, "When one begins to philosophize, one must start out as a Spinozist. The soul must bathe in this ether of the one substance, in which everything one held to be true has perished. Every philosopher must have arrived at this negation of everything particular. It is the liberation of the spirit, die Befreiung des Geistes, and its absolute basis." These statements belong to a larger pattern of Hegelian thought, linking the inception of philosophical thinking with themes of intellectual liberation and elevation above the sphere of contingent existence. Hegel returns to this theme repeatedly throughout his career, for instance, in his lectures on the proofs of the existence of God, the last work he completed before his death in 1831. The following reflection is taken from his discussion of the cosmological argument, also known significantly, I think, as the argument a contingentia mundi. So here's the long quotation for which I've apologized in advance, number 7 on your handout. "The reason that spirit elevates itself above contingency and external necessity is that these thoughts are in themselves, and as such, insufficient and unsatisfying. Spirit finds satisfaction in the thought of absolute necessity because it signifies being at peace with oneself. The result of this thought of absolute necessity, however, taken as a result, is simply, it is as it is, es ist so. Absolutely necessary. And all longing, striving, desiring for anything other has therefore disappeared. For an absolute necessity, the other has itself passed away. Nothing exists outside it, and it contains no limits within itself, for its very being consists in being at one with itself, bei sich selbst sein." If we pause for a moment, he continues, to consider this subjective satisfaction, it may remind us of the satisfaction the Greeks found in submitting to necessity. Yield to ineluctable fate was the admonition of the wise and the truth enunciated by the tragic chorus especially. And we admire the calm with which the tragic heroes accepted their fate freely and with unbending spirit, ungebeugten Geistes. The satisfaction that the spirit finds in the thought of necessity is only to be found in the fact that spirit adheres to the abstract result of necessity. It is as it is, a result that the spirit brings about in itself. This pure is emptied of all content, all purposes, interests, desires. Even the concrete feeling of life has disappeared from it. Spirit brings about this abstract result by relinquishing the content of its will and abnegating the substance of its life. It thereby transforms the force of destiny into freedom, for such force can only lay hold of it by seizing upon the aspects of its concrete existence that have a determinate internal or external being. But external existence is rooted in internal existence, in human drives, interests, goals. And these ties are what bind us and expose us to external force. Their roots are internal, however, and belong to the individual, who is therefore able to tear them from his heart. When the heart thus renounces itself, nothing is left that force could lay hold of, and what it crushes is a heartless existence, a mere externality in which there is no person for the blow to strike. The person has gone from the place where the blow is landed. End of quote. And here you might feel reminded in various ways of, the Buddhist dimension of Pyrrhonian skepticism that Michael briefly gestured at yesterday, and which I also think is unmistakably present there. Granted, Hegel's praise for self-abnegation and withdrawal from the world is not his last word on freedom and the value of existence. Even so, he is not equivocating, I think, when he suggests that a natural and to a limited extent legitimate human response to a world of overpowering contingency is to deny its independent reality and concomitantly to posit and identify oneself with a completely undetermined and hence perfectly empty necessary being as a kind of vanishing point. For our present discussion, this negative side of human freedom is sufficient to illuminate Hegel's next remarks on the nature of Pyrrhonian skepticism. As we're about to see, he associates Pyrrhonism with an urge to resist, at the most fundamental level, entanglement with the worldly ties that expose the human individual to coercion, violence, and ruin. On Hegel's account, the Pyrrhonist finds the means of such resistance in a voluntary and anticipatory abnegation of whatever is susceptible to being robbed from him by external forces. In the words of the early Pyrrhonist Timon, desire is absolutely the first of all bad things. End of quote. So here's the passage, number 8, from the Skepticism essay itself, where Hegel makes this point about the intellectual liberty the Pyrrhonist achieves. Skepticism, he says, raises the entire scope of actuality and certainty to the power of uncertainty, and thereby eradicates the ordinary dogmatism that is unconsciously committed to customs and laws as a power for which the individual is nothing but an object. The individual may comprehend particular aspects of this power by observing the sequence of its effects and compiling a sensible body of knowledge about them, but it thereby succeeds merely in sinking ever more deeply into the service of that power. End of quote. It might be objected that Hegel's description of the skeptic's attitude towards the entirety of his natural and social environment, including especially the customs and laws of his community, flies in the face of what Sextus teaches about Pyrrhonism, according to whom I should allow my transient, situation-specific, action-guiding quasi-beliefs to be dictated by what he calls the guidance of nature, namely by, I quote, necessitation through involuntary feelings, the handing down of laws and customs, and teaching of kinds of expertise, as Sextus terms the four sources of everyday observations. However, I would suggest that Hegel is relying here, as elsewhere in the text, on an implicit distinction between the original philosophy of Pyrrho and what his later followers made of it, and in some cases added to it. In this respect, Hegel's description of the extent to which the Pyrrhonian liberates himself intellectually from the common sense of his community captures something of Pyrrho's own highly unconventional behavior, as reported by Diogenes Laertius and his traditional sources, which bespeaks a contempt for conventional laws and customs rather than an acknowledgement of their guidance as practical criteria for decision and action. It's Sextus, not Hegel, who departs from Ur-Pyrrhonism when he allows laws and customs to serve as pragmatic criteria for action, as though action and the continuation of life were what the original kind of Pyrrhonist impulse was about in the first place. However, Hegel goes significantly beyond anything to be found in ancient testimony about the skeptical way of life, if you want to call it that, when he suggests the following positive explanation of Pyrrhonian non-assertion and tranquility, number 9. In recognizing, he says, that there is nothing to this natural necessity, the skeptic is elevated above it by the freedom of reason. At the same time, he pays highest honor to it, just as he does not hold any of its particulars to be something certain, but only necessity itself in its universality, nor does he himself introduce any particularity into it as an absolute purpose he would seek to accomplish in the sphere of necessity, as though he knew what is good. In the individual, he anticipates that which necessity, stretched out in the finitude of time, will unconsciously bring to pass among the unconscious human race. Time wrenches from them what they held to be absolutely one and the same, solid, eternal, and identically constituted in all times and places. End of quote. So I think that Hegel not only is embracing radical Pyrrhonism, but he's embracing a Pyrrhonism that's more radical than anything you find even really in Sextus. Here then finally in this last quotation, the elements I highlighted in Hegel's discussion of the argument a contingentia mundi and tragic freedom are also made explicit for his account of Pyrrhonism. Hegel does not portray the skeptic as issuing an epistemological challenge, but as disengaging from the world by consciously anticipating the inevitable vicissitudes of interests, beliefs, commitments, projects, and goals, and of eradicating them in advance from his heart. In Hegel's presentation of it, the skeptical ideal would appear to consist not merely in severe ascetic withdrawal, but in a depersonalizing identification with necessity itself in its universality, which is a completely empty concept. I mean, that's what I think you have to remember. So when I'm talking about, I'll come back to this later, but necessity itself in its universality is not a concept that has any kind of determinate content. Yeah? Its only kind of determination is that it's not in any sense contingent. Yeah? But as Kant points out in his critique of the idea of ins necessarium, yeah? An unconditional being, an unconditionally necessary being is just nothing that we can really associate any kind of cognitive content with at all. And I think that that's like the point, yeah? That's like the punchline of this whole discourse. So to continue then, I'm reminded in this context of Schelling's words in a famous letter to Hegel about the philosophical letters just about the time it was being published. He says, "Our highest endeavor is the destruction of our personality." Hegel's Pyrrhonist would very much appear to be animated by the same ideal. The emptiness of the ins necessarium correlates with what he calls here necessity in itself in its universality, and both in their very emptiness serve as image-like reflections of the depersonalization and desubjectivation that the Pyrrhonian skeptic, on Hegel's interpretation, identifies with freedom. So I'm almost ready now to turn my attention to Schelling, but before leaving Hegel, we should notice the surprising twist he gives to his account of Pyrrhonism at just this point, where he suddenly seems to switch direction. Immediately after what, to all appearance, is a move towards aesthetic depersonalization, Hegel locates what he calls the positive side of skepticism and Pyrrho's individual character. This is the passage I quoted at the beginning of my talk, and here it is again with some surrounding text. Now because, this is quote 10, now because the positive side of skepticism was comprised solely by the skeptic's character, it was not presented as a sect or a school, but as an agoge, the preparation, Erziehung, for a way of life. As an original human being, so the German here is origineller Mensch, and that might be a kind of reference to Pyrrho's unconventional character. And if you kind of scan Hegel's text for the word originär, you'll find that he's very ambivalent about this word. So originär is for him often a kind of denigrating term, right? Not always, but even where he applies it positively, for example, to Hamann, he does it with this very ambivalent kind of gesture. So I'd encourage you to read his review of Hamann's works and look at what he says about Hamann's style there, because it's actually parallels into like the verbal construction of the description. It parallels what he says about Pyrrho in interesting and suggestive ways. But that would have been one quote too many. Okay, so as an original human being, ein origineller Mensch, Pyrrho became a philosopher on his own terms, auf seine Faust, as he says, like all founders of schools. But his original philosophy was not for that reason something peculiar to him, and hence necessarily by virtue of its very principle opposed to other philosophies. Rather, he says, than expressing the individuality of his character in a philosophy, his individual character was his philosophy. And his philosophy is nothing but freedom of character. And how could any philosophy be opposed? We've heard this at the beginning. How could any philosophy be opposed in this respect? To skepticism. So, to say that Pyrrho's philosophy was not an expression of his character, but rather that Pyrrho's character was his philosophy, is to retract what is vital about Pyrrhonism entirely from the theoretical or objective side of the movement, for example, from its phrases, tropes, arguments for, against this and that, and hence also from its external polemical relation to whatever dogmatic positions the skeptic should chance to encounter, and to redirect attention solely toward what we might call, with Schelling, the practical certainty of the individual life. Let's now take stock of what has been said. Hegel's discussion of Pyrrhonism focuses on the idea of the elevation and liberation of the mind. The mind is unfree to the extent that it is enthralled by transient and contingent aspects of reality that, by their very nature, are such as to be neither truly knowable nor an adequate medium for the exercise of freedom, and which are thus incapable of expressing the unity and eternality of reason as conceived by Schelling and Hegel during the period in question. As the argument a contingentia mundi suggests, such contingency extends from individual existences even to the laws of nature. Skepticism therefore properly encompasses, quote, the entire scope of actuality and certainty. The liberation of the mind from the sphere of contingency consists in negating everything about itself that renders it an object for external forces. And since it is by virtue of its very particularity that the self is enmeshed in the world, authentic skepticism coincides with an ascetic ideal of self-abnegation and the embrace of an utterly empty, necessary being as the vanishing point of its elevation above the world of contingency and transiency. Somewhat paradoxically, however, what appears in the objectifying medium of theoretical reflection as pure emptiness and negativity is experienced positively as the individual self-assertion of character in the subjective medium of practical certainty. The two aspects of skepticism, what it says and what it does, therefore not only fall asunder, but appear as contradictory. The skeptic's reflective self-abnegation, practically lived, constitutes a self-assertion of unparalleled intensity. Or at least that's the image of authentic Pyrrhonism, as portrayed by Hegel. So now to Shelling. In the Philosophical Letters on Dogmatism and Criticism, Shelling defines dogmatism as theoretical commitment to the mind-independent objective reality of a non-finite ground of existence. God, say, substance. And criticism as a contrary commitment to the metaphysical priority of finite subjectivity. His central line of argument is that purely theoretical differences between these two positions are not sufficient to decide between them. Even the critique of pure reason has done no more than to clarify the proper form and scope of a philosophical system in general, and leaves open the question of the relative superiority of metaphysical realism and idealism. The real test, Shelling thinks, lies in the individual's practical ability to realize one or the other of the systems practically and existentially. A system of knowledge, he writes, gains reality, quote, not through a theoretical faculty, but through a practical one, not through a cognitive faculty, but through a productive faculty of realization, not by knowing, but by acting, end of quote. Consequently, no one comes to be convinced of the truth of a system of philosophy other than practically, that is, by realizing one of the two possible systems in himself, end of quote. The practical individualism of this conception of philosophy is clearly incompatible with dogmatism in the more usual sense of commitment to a set of beliefs as true, binding, and unrevisable. Shelling himself goes on to say, quote, 11 on the handout, nothing is more ruinous for philosophy than the attempt to force it into the boundaries of a universally valid theoretical system. Whoever undertakes to do so is devoid of the authentically critical spirit, which seeks to strike down the vain obsession with demonstrations and proofs in order to save the freedom of science, end quote. The claim that striking down the vain obsession with demonstrations and proofs, what I'm rendering here in that way is Demonstriersucht. The claim that striking down the vain obsession with proofs is a means for preserving the freedom of science is of a piece with Schelling's reinterpretation of transcendental idealism as propounding not the weakness, but the creative strength of human reason and its very finitude. This fundamentally optimistic reinterpretation of Kantian criticism encourages a similarly oriented interpretation of the zetetic character of Pyrrhonism. The notion of an endless search after truth could easily seem disheartening, even in the more optimistic modern guise of an infinite approximation to knowledge. If both our present state of belief and all future states of belief are infinitely removed from proper apprehension of the truth, then even on the assumption that we are moving in the right direction, whatever that might mean, our best theories will always remain hopelessly incomparable to the truth. So if truth is the goal of inquiry, and that which lends knowledge its special value, then the idea of an infinite approximation tends to render inquiry futile and hence valueless beyond whatever pragmatic and technological advantages our limited theories might afford. Right, I mean, I think that Michael Williams has something like this in mind where he says, well, we shouldn't think of truth as the goal of inquiry, right? We're not moving towards truth. We're solving problems, right? And so you've got a certain kind of problem, you solve it, that's progress, but it's not progress towards something. Yeah? It's progress away from, a messy state of affairs that's causing us problems in some pragmatic way. I don't think that's what's going on here. Even though Schelling explicitly embraces the idea that the process of inquiry is an infinite task, he rejects the notion that this compromises the intrinsic value of scientific endeavor. So the question is, what allows him to do that? How can you embrace infinite approximation and still think that cognition, scientific cognition, is somehow a valuable enterprise? Now, at several points in the Philosophical Letters, Schelling suggests that while cognition is an essential and inseparable feature of subjectivity, cognition is nonetheless not a constitutive feature of subjectivity. Yeah, so cognition is an essential and inseparable feature of subjectivity, but it's not a constitutive feature of subjectivity. It's somehow derivative in a certain way. It says, anything that is not explainable on the basis of our pure being and our absolute essence is determined by passivity. As soon as we step outside ourselves, we are placed in a condition of passivity. Reason, however, is not comprehensible on the basis of our absolute being, but only as the consequence of a limitation of what is absolute in us. So, since I think, and I won't argue this in any way, but since I think that for Shelling, to be finite is to be subjective, so that subjectivity and finitude are inseparable. Cognition is inseparable from subjectivity, but it's not that somehow cognition constitutes subjectivity, but a kind of limitation, a kind of finitude constitutes subjectivity, the result of which is a kind of cognitive relation to otherness, right? The structure of consciousness. The implication is, first, that individual personality and rational subjectivity more generally are relational features, not substantial ones. To the extent that we would be able to remove ourselves from the relations that constitute our individuality and subjectivity, we would, by that very means, de-individualize, de-subjectify, de-personalize ourselves. And in contrast to those passively given relations, the drive to overcome them is precisely what is substantial in our being, though to call it our being is presumably already to attribute to it a particularity and personality that is, on Schelling's early conception, foreign to it. Hence the remark from his letter to Hegel, cited above, that our highest endeavor is the destruction of our personality, the transition to the absolute sphere of being. There's obviously a similarity here between this conception of cognition and Hegel's description of the elevation and liberation of the spirit and the Skepticism essay. Rational subjectivity is, in the first instance, finite personality, and finite persons are constitutionally exposed to relations and forces beyond their control. The act of empowerment and liberation of subjectivity takes the shape of a progressive disengagement from such relations and forces, concomitant with a progressive depersonalization driven by the subject's identification with a purely impersonal, indeed utterly empty, necessary being. Yet we also recognize here the same twists we found in Hegel's account of Pyrrhonism. I should say, really, the conception that's driving this for me is more or less a kind of Spinozist amor Dei intellectualis. I think this is a kind of, post-Kantian reinterpretation of that and application to the skepticism. Same twists we found in Hegel. The experience of rational insight that accompanies the theoretical depersonalization of the subject is in itself an experience of self-activity and self-affirmation. Of the chief exemplar of metaphysical realism, Spinoza, Schelling therefore says, quotation 12, Spinoza objectified this intuition of his self. When he intuited what is intellectual in himself, the absolute ceased to be an object for him. This was an experience, and it allowed of two different interpretations. Spinoza believed himself identical with the absolute object and lost in its infinitude. He was mistaken. Aided by the fact that by necessity, whatever one thinks, one always also thinks oneself, in the very act of intuiting himself as annihilated, in the absolute object he was still intuiting himself. He could not conceive himself as annihilated without at the same time conceiving himself as existing. End of quote. The process of scientific creativity is, for lack of a better word, dialectical. Considered in its objectifying theoretical element, it entails the progressive decentering and depersonalization of the subject of cognition, as she strives to achieve what Thomas Nagel, in a similar context, has called the view from nowhere. The mark of authentically scientific cognition is insight into necessity, the construction of explanations that, in a finite series of steps, exhibit the genesis or conditions of a state of affairs in a way that compels rational assent, sort of like what we heard from Descartes. As an ideal, let's call it the demonstrative ideal of knowledge, this endeavor tends toward an explanatory scheme of universal scope that would subordinate and subsume the human cognitive process itself. under its objectifying principles, say in the form of an evolutionary theory of epistemology. But the impulse towards this kind and scope of explanation is different in kind from the results it produces. It is an immediately positive and hence intrinsically valuable experience of individual intensification and empowerment, one that Spinoza famously associated with the emotion of joy. As I understand Shelling, this purely practical dimension of the experience of rational insight is what leads us to value science and the truth of scientific propositions as such, although the correctness, empirical adequacy, and explanatory power of scientific theories is certainly not merely extrinsic to their value, and neither, of course, should we be contemptuous of their pragmatic and technological advantages. It's for this reason that Shelling regards the prospect of an infinite approximation to the truth as a manifestation of the freedom of science, and not as a bleak reminder of the unattainability of its goal. Zetetic skepticism accordingly appears not as a chastening admonition of the futility of human claims to science, but as an optimistic, practical commitment to the inexhaustibility of the knowable as an arena for human achievement and infinite perfectibility. Never does a philosopher and scientist feel himself greater, Shelling writes, quotation 13, than in the moment he beholds an infinitude of knowledge stretching before him. The entire sublimity of his science, he says, consists precisely in the impossibility of ever completing it. Were he himself ever to believe he had completed his system, he would no longer be able to bear himself. He would in that very moment cease to be a creator and sink to the level of a mere instrument of his creation. How much more unbearable must he then find the thought of being subjected to such a fate by someone else? End of quote. So I come now to the brief conclusion. At the outset of my argument, I introduced as a point of contrast what I called the Cartesian understanding of intellectual freedom and self-determination as a beneficent form of psychological compulsion, the inability to doubt. The methodologically privileged case of such indubitability occurs when we self-consciously subject our thoughts to a process of shifting, or sifting rather, whose purpose is to isolate those among them that are clear and distinct. Perhaps I'm not alone in finding this conception of rational insight familiar, resonant, and attractive. It is a direct descendant of what the Stoics termed cataleptic impressions and held to be self-validating cognitive states that served as their own criterion of truth. This conception and the experience that underlies it are most at home in mathematical cognition, the paradigm case for the demonstrative ideal of knowledge, but natural scientists can presumably appeal to close analogs of it. The modality of rational insight is necessity. There have been those in the rationalist tradition, Leibniz in particular, who sought to cast the experience of rational necessitation in logical terms. On his view, truths of reason, indeed all truths, would reduce to tautologies, and the corresponding metaphysical scheme would be a thoroughgoing determinism. A similar view is clearly also at work in the substance monism of Spinoza, to whose system classical German philosophers often perceived Leibniz as being all too close for comfort. When we push the ideal of rational insight too far in this direction, we begin to get into philosophical trouble. Either we entangle ourselves in conceptually dubious notions such as that of an ens necessarium, of which Kant was the first to point out that it is a concept with which the human mind cannot associate any determinate content. Isolated from its function vis-a-vis the series of conditioned entities, it's perfectly empty. Or we fall upon the difficulty that the metaphysical image of the world corresponding to the demonstrative ideal is a necessitarianism that pulls the rug from beneath the cognitive striving for self-determination that made it seem attractive in the first place. So we ought to exercise caution in seeking to conceptualize the experience of rational self-determination in terms that too closely mimic the logical hallmarks of rational insight. The post-Kantian response to this state of affairs is to draw attention to what is valuable in scientific cognition and what makes the demonstrative ideal of knowledge attractive. Though Schelling and Hegel do not embrace the Cartesian conception of rational self-determination, neither do they simply reject it. Instead, they seek to embed it within a richer account of the relation between the theoretical and practical axiological dimensions of cognition. As we saw, there's a disparity between these two sides. The objectifying theoretical element of cognition, which figures as a kind of universal necessitation that the subject can evade only by means of a monstrous act of self-abnegation and identification with the absolute object. That sentence didn't come off very well. As we saw, there's a disparity between these two sides. The objectifying theoretical element of cognition figures as a kind of necessitation that the subject can only evade by self-abnegation. By contrast, the purely practical, subjective element of rational cognition accompanies the insight into necessity as a feeling of individual autonomy and empowerment. In Schelling's words, quote 14, "As long as we are engaged in realizing our system, the certainty we have of it is purely practical. Our knowledge of it is realized by our striving to complete it. Were we to complete our task at any determinate point in time, the system would become an object of knowledge and thereby cease to be an object of freedom." End of quote. For both Schelling and Hegel, the interpretation of Pyrrhonism is a way of highlighting the priority of this practical axiological dimension of cognition over the theoretical dimension in which it is reflected and objectified. It is true that they highlight this priority in different ways. Hegel emphasizes the more ascetic and, if you will, dogmatic or metaphysical realist aspect of Pyrrho's philosophy. Schelling, by contrast, emphasizes the zetetic character of ancient skepticism, casting it in terms that are markedly optimistic and perfectionist, and which highlight the persistence of concrete individuality as the locus of the experienced value of cognition and rational insight. But they both situate Pyrrhonism in a common philosophical framework. What makes this framework illuminating is that it allows us to pull apart the experienced value of cognitive self-determination from the logical features of the content in respect to which it is realized. Pyrrhonism truly has no doctrinal content, both in respect to the ethics of non-assertion, evidenced by historical Pyrrhonists, and in respect to the notion of necessity in itself in its universality that Hegel reconstructs as a theoretical or reflective correlate of non-assertion. We are dealing with a cognitive state that is devoid of determinate content. So here there can be no suggestion that the Pyrrhonists' intellectual self-determination is a function of the determinate content of insight as it is on the Cartesian conception. On the other side, however, this empty representation, be it of the non-truth valuability of competing beliefs, be it of an engulfing ens necessarium, becomes readable as the reflective trace of a subjective experience of empowerment, increased perfection, or as Spinoza saw, of joy, an experience that is non-cognitive in itself, but inseparable from cognitive activity, an experience of freedom and self-determination. This framework not only opens an interesting axiological perspective on the philosophy of knowledge, it also suggests the solution to the psychological puzzle of skeptical ataraxia and the life without belief that deserves, I think, to be more widely known. Thank you for your attention.